Jā, labdien! Dear ladies and gentlemen, as the Executive Director of the Baltic German University Office, on behalf of the office, I would like to welcome you all here today to the guest lecture, Urban Land by Professor Ute Margarete Meyer. But before we start, I would like to introduce Professor Meyer to you. She is a Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Climate Engineering and Professor of Urban Design at the University of Applied Sciences, Bīberahas in Germany. Before taking the position of Dean, she was Director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Development at the University and initiated research projects about the potential of resilient urban development in non-metropolitan areas. She is one of the two principals of the urban design and consultancy practice Bureau Schneider-Meyer in Stuttgart and Cologne, which she co-founded in 2003. Professor Meyer is a member of the German Academy for Urban Development and Regional Planning and the Association of German Architects. She studied in Germany, Italy, and in the United States, and has a diploma in architecture and urban design from Stuttgart University, as well as Master of Science in Advanced Architectural Design from Columbia University. And it is an honor to have Professor Meyer here, and please, the floor is yours.
Can you help me start it? Yeah, it's my honor to be here, really. Thank you so much for the invitation. Also on behalf of the Urban Institute, which I think is responsible for all this in a way. And thank you for uploading my lecture. I was asked, could I not, before having this meeting tonight, could I not have an impulse also here at the university, which I deliberately do. I thought I might want to introduce you to some of my field of interest at the moment, or field of focus, of research, what we are doing at my school in terms of urban planning, and I hope it falls into an interested audience at this point. So I will try to stay within an hour. That's what we said, and I will go through 5 chapters of the lecture. Obviously, one is introduction, a little bit of the background, say something about the urban age, as we're all familiar with, then tell you something about the area, the region where I come from, as a case study where we look into, tell you something why we are interested in some international precedents and what they could tell us about that so-called urban land, which is the overriding label I'm going to talk a lot about. Intermediate density in Europe is more of a quantitative approach to the same issue. I'm going to lose a couple of words to this, density in Europe and beyond. And I will really try to stick to an hour to then open up to you and have you have your questions if you desire so. So we're all familiar with these kind of images that we know very well. The world's population is not only growing, it is accumulating in urban areas. Normally, if people say urban areas, they look at these kind of maps and they look at the large dots, and they sort of concentrate on the big cities. And a lot of research, at least of the more known research, maybe in a way, has been looking into these large metropolitan areas that are spread worldwide. How can they grow in a more resilient way? How can they grow in a more integrated way, and also maybe also a coordinated way? And there are 3 main issues that normally come up with it, that they say, well, if we want to have get some grip on the development, urban growth has to be coordinated, it has to be compact, the compact European city, I'm sure you're all familiar with that concept, and it has to be very well accessible. So in a way, a lot has been said about the large urban areas. I've been working at the London School of Economics in the recent past, and they have been very famous for labeling all that development as the urban age and coming up with these kind of images. And but still, it's very much concentrated on the large, well-known urban areas worldwide, such as London, Berlin, Istanbul, New York, and you could, prolong this list as far as you want. The London School of Economics, where I borrowed this image from, has been very interested and also successful in visualizing data. I think that's their the most valuable achievement maybe in the last 10 years. So what they did is that they visualized statistics in a way. So if we want to look at this table for an instance, because I'm going to come up with it, come back to this in a second, you would see that in terms of you would see comparisons between London, Berlin, and Istanbul, for example, on the current population. London, 8 million people, Berlin, much less, Istanbul, much larger, obviously. But if we go to the other segments, you see something about growth percentages. You would see how large is the area. And then, I mean, if you sort of read it along this line and start comparing the figures throughout the tablets, you see that they always have things in common among each other, but they also have very wide differences. London, for example, has a very, let me go, I think getting out of the microphone area. Berlin, for example, has a very low growth rate, but it's very, I'm sorry to do this because I have to, I think I'd rather. And they have a very high, London, for example, let's put it like this. London has a very high percentage of urban growth in their capital region. Berlin doesn't have it that much. Istanbul does have that. But if you go back then to the GDP per person, then again you find out that Istanbul, for example, although having a high growth rate, doesn't have half of the GDP per capita that London has. My point is that the main achievement of the research at the LSE has been that they have made certain data that normally vanish in statistics accessible through visualization. Normally we focus, and this is much more the point where I want to come to. Normally we focus on the areas that you see the names out here: London, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, or Budapest, and it seems all to be about the large urban centers. What I want to introduce now today is another field of research that has started to look into not the big labels of the capital cities, but into all the red stuff, let's put it like this. So what we are trying to do, that we try to apply the same logic of research, visualizing data, looking at potentials of resilient growth through mapping, but not in the large capital areas, but in all the urbanized territory that we very well see here in a European context that lies all in between. And I know I've learned from my talks this morning and my conversations this morning that it's very much of an issue here in and around Riga as well. So I have a bit of a definition to start with: urban Europe, and it actually is running, as we've seen, all across Middle and Central Europe. Polycentric urban clusters, or patterns of intermediate density in functional metropolitan areas, or, and that's another pattern, chains of medium-sized individual towns along transport corridors, be that automotive or be that train corridors, are typical urbanization patterns across Europe. So that would be my point. This is a challenge, of course. Knowledge has been accumulated in Riga and elsewhere, and exchanged also on an international basis on the character and challenges of these multifaceted urban environments. But it's still, and that's our approach, needs definition of how the new urban role that has been given to the cities by the urban agenda at European level can be put into action in these patterns. It has been quite clear how the urban agenda has facilitated an approach for cities to get European funding, but it hasn't been clear how these medium-sized or smaller cities, if they have a concerted action, could possibly become more also potential partners on a European level. So if you think back to the very first image I've shown you with all the large, colorful growing dots, so Mumbai and Bogota, it all seems to be focusing on the large areas. You could also raise another image, and I'm borrowing this from a US research conducted by Neil Brenner at the Harvard University, and they draw a quite different image of urbanization worldwide. And then they're actually saying, well, if you focus on these large areas in these large dots, it's also a political agenda. So might we not, try to realize a little bit that the urbanization is not only accumulating and basically concentrating in a still countable number of large urban areas and large urban, potentially monocentric structures, but might we not realize that urbanization is an additional thing? Well, because yes, it's true that these large areas like London, like Bogota, like Mumbai and whatever, they are existing. But in between, there's all that red stuff you've seen on the European level, and this is also happening worldwide. This would be my point. So this said, as a background, just to sort of raise the consciousness maybe about that issue and give you sort of an introduction to it, I would want to show you a little bit where I come from and zoom in the southwest of Germany, bordering to France and Switzerland in that case, and that's what it looks like. This is a part of the Lake Constance, and I picked this image to not only show you that, of course, it's an intermingling structure of settlement, landscape, and water, and you probably, this could, in a way, it could be Riga, maybe, yeah, it doesn't look that different. So that's what we are interested in, that sort of trifold structure, blue, green, and red, if you want. So if red would be the settlement. So this is just an image to talk about the structure, but also maybe to allude a bit to the beauty of it, because obviously there's something really beautiful and enjoyable in that threefold pattern that can be fertilized also in terms of resilient development. That would be my point. So if you map that area, you say, I don't know if you see that if I do like this, yeah. This is Lake Constance, and this is not the settlement points, it's actually the roads. So it's funny to see if you map that, and that's a map for an atlas we've been producing about the southwest of Germany in my school. If you map only the roads, it gives you the same idea of density as the settlement, as mapping houses, so that's one thing. The next thing you see that it's basically all covered. It's not true that it's the dots and in between there's rural nothingness. It's all covered in more or less dense patterns. So this is what our backdrop is, and we try to unravel the potentials for resilient growth within that pattern. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Leipzig Charter, which basically says stay to the compact knots. Don't build any further into the landscape. Stay within the existing settlement, which is all nice and true. And I wouldn't want to contradict that in any sense. But if you look at that kind of pattern, the question is, where's the knot exactly? Or is it not many knots? Or what does compact mean? And what does connected mean? And what does coordinated mean, most of all? So this is a collection of images that half of them come from this region I've just showed you, the southwest of Germany, Lake Constance here. This is the Rhine Valley, France, Switzerland, the area where my school is. So they either come from there or they come from Berlin. And I would bet you couldn't tell which one comes from where, and I'm not going to tell you. And the point, obviously, is that behind all that also lies the question, what is urban, really? Because we have some sort of consciousness and idea about urbanity, and I would argue that part of that drag of people, at least within Europe, into the large urban traditional urban areas, it's because they are looking for a particular lifestyle or some connotation of that lifestyle. And it's assumedly present in Berlin or in Brussels or in Rome or in Paris or London, and maybe not so somewhere between Lake Constance and Stuttgart. But if you look what is really there, you find that maybe it's not that much of a difference, really. I wouldn't say it's the same thing that you live somewhere in between Stuttgart and the Lake Constance or in Berlin. That I wouldn't go that far. But it's much more of a gray distribution of potentials than it's a black and white image. So that's actually that panorama of images has become quite a central trigger for the research we are doing. So now I come back to that famous famous Excel or whatever sheet. I've been struggling before because I can't see it with my glasses. That's the whole point. But the point is really easy to make, because before you've seen some traditional urban growth centers being compared among each other, and we could start to see that they perform quite differently in growth or in economic or in population or in also carbon dioxide emission aspects. What is interesting now, if we compare the so-called urban land, which is basically all the area that you've seen before, and again I borrow from the London School of Economics their comparison, which you see here in the bottom. If we compare that urban land to the performance of London, for example, you would see that in terms of GDP per capita, it has almost the same London performance, which is quite an interesting insight, really, because London has sort of the best in the world. So, of course, it in a much larger area, admittedly, which you see here, yeah, 1 million square meters there, and it has, you know, some more cars, not that many. It is a horrendous, in comparison, CO2 emission balance, which is only that good because there's Switzerland inside, part of Switzerland, otherwise it would be even worse, which is due to car traffic, obviously. So what's the point in this? The point in this is that if you look at the potentials of this area closely, you find that there's an urban appearance in terms of economic performance, but there are many issues that lag behind not a global, but a European urban standard, if you might say so, in terms of carbon dioxide emission reductions, in terms of public transport, for example, or transport whatsoever, kind of new mobility aspects, and all that. So the point is, where we do have an idea about how to develop that prototype of a city, the classical idea of a European compact city within its boundaries, if that's still existing or not, might, you know, it's another issue. But we have the Leipzig Charter and all the European law basically describes an idea of compactness, which is still sort of differentiable from some sort of surroundings that is then more rural or more natural. We have written down an idea about that. We haven't so much written about this, right? But we have written about it, but we haven't, you know, an agenda or a leitmotif to follow to deal with that. And obviously, that's much more of a pattern that would be running throughout all the red corridors in Europe that I've shown you before. This is how the area looks like specifically. So there's no more Berlin images mixed in, and it's much more of an idea of the physical shape and the green, red, blue structures that you would find then in the area of southwest Germany. And it's zooming in quite, you know, deliberately on certain aspects. But if you would go through all the different images, you find that you have it all there. Basically, you have industry, you have water, you have energy production, you have landscape, well, never ever in terms of nature, but you have forest areas, you have agriculture, you have new and old means of energy production, you have very little circular economy or circular production, but it starts to happen. You have settlement in old historical knots, you have settlement from the 60s, you have industrial areas, and all sorts of different patterns. In this area specifically, it has also a historic tradition, in a sense that, if you can see this here, the little light blue patch is again Lake Constance. So this is Germany, this is France here. And in the immediate area, which is now, where we're focusing into, you have already historically in 1800, you have a very small scale and fragmented land use structure, because there were a number of monasteries coming also from Switzerland who were very confined in themselves and had a very, they already historically established that pattern of little property, small-scale properties sitting close to each other. For that and also for other reasons, the region has actually been quite late. When it was industrialized, it was much later than the rural area, for example, much later than Belgium or areas in Netherlands. But for that, because a lot of industrialization and a lot of also development in that sense had already taken place. They found a niche, you would say today, for production. And the area, you might think of the Zeppelin, for example, or other mechanical engineering that has become famous worldwide then. They have become actually famous for technological innovation and mechanical engineering ever since. It would have been labeled differently, but that was actually the point. Also, weapon production, not such a pleasant sector, but still. So in all wrapped in the mechanical engineering, that has always been the profile, you would say today, of the region. So why am I saying this? Because we will see later that potential to have global players in a region that's supposedly rural is anchored already traditionally. So this is just to introduce that to you. Then it has been a mixture of these specific heritages, such as the small-scale pattern of land use, such as late industrialization and a focus on mechanical engineering. But of course, it has also had other phases that run all through Europe. It has had a large suburbanization process after World War II, which people, which with the mobilization and everything, dragged people out of the inner cities and led to what we call sprawl now, which runs, this is what this stands for, all across Europe, as I've shown you before, and this has already in the 80s been labeled the so-called blue banana, this sort of image. It goes from UK through Netherlands, Belgium, or the Rhine Valley. This is where southwest Germany is into northern Italy, and it's still, at the time they were talking more about the economic performance. Now we would talk about that issue of intermediate density in all the urbanized territory in between the large city cores. So this is more generic developments which the region has seen itself. So if we jump a bit ahead, there has been literature in Germany on the so-called Zwischenstadt, which would mean city in between, already 20 years ago, which was very intensively discussed in the academic realm then. But after that, soon after that, after I would say maybe late 90s, 2000, as we were focusing in very much on the compact European city and the resilient potentials of that compactness, we didn't, the academic realm also didn't look that closely into that potential of the city in between anymore. Nearly 20% of the people living in Germany today have a migratory background, which is, I'm just saying that because that's also doesn't account only for cities as Berlin, but is spread in Germany basically throughout the country, throughout the nation. So, and now the two last images are more important. Maybe we have one thing, we have an energy transition, which is talked about very seriously in Germany, and that opens the door for planning discussion. Why is that? Because on a large scale, people all start to reconfigure their infrastructure, which hasn't happened in the last 50 years. And that reconfiguring and that imparts, at least, necessary process of decentralization, if you talk about feeding a whole country more or less regeneratively, that uproots the planning discussions in a way that all of a sudden it's possible also to talk about other things. And that has culminated in a document that has been published in 2016, I'm sorry, by the German Advisory Council on Global Change, who has looked on a national, also international level, and consulting national policies, saying, well, we've been looking into the potential of urban resilience quite a bit now, and we would recommend you, as an advisory board, we would recommend national policies to look much closer into the potentials of polycentric structures. So, said this, I want to come back to the region and give you a little bit of an image of what it looks like if you zoom in a bit closer. So this little bit here is the Lake Constance. You're familiar now by now. This is Ulm. It's a medium-sized town. This is again the same thing, but zoomed in a bit more from what I've shown you before of the road mapping, and you see again, you know, where it concentrates a bit, but it's basically covering the whole territory. So we produced in the atlas, we produced these paths that are supposed to tell you immediately something about the bipolarity or the controversy maybe in between this area. So you have either, on one side you have an overriding settlement ambition laid down by the omnipresence of streets and accessibility basically everywhere. On the other hand, you have something which is still, well, I'm not saying untouched nature, but still a large landscape potential, and also ecological biodiversity and border resilience potential for that matter. We started to map businesses in the area, and it's not an area that is by any means, maybe I should tell you that the largest street, Ulm, has, well, 100,000 inhabitants maybe, and everything else, or 80 I guess it is, and everything else in between has 20,000 or 40,000 at the least. So it's not, none of this is large city area, but you have the red dots in this are large businesses that operate on a national level, and the ones with the blue circles are businesses that are global players. Some of them are market leaders. So it's an amazing concentration in that area that supposedly is rural and not urban at all. It comes along with the kind of building production that goes along with it. But what is interesting again, that we would find on almost each time bordering of these global player businesses, well connected along the roads, bordering to landscape, which is not the image that you would have of an urban area. But if you remember the Excel sheet, the performance is urban, supposedly. So this contradiction is basically what we are interested in. If you map clustering, in that map you would have the little red circles, again the global players. Then you have, can I make this bigger? Well, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't. Then you have business concentration in terms of clustering of branches. We have high biopharmaceutical and biochemical clusters. We have mechanical engineering, which is the blue stuff, the bio stuff is the green stuff, and automotive is the red stuff. And in some parts, it's concentrating in a way that you can't unravel it anymore. Again, this is supposedly rural or non-urban. What is accessible? we have some, there's not one motorway, but it's national roads, and we have train accessibility, and not surprisingly, the settlement already is clustered along these transportation lines. So it's all very well accessible. In a way, it repeats the point from before that although this is the case, it's still, not. It doesn't have to face the concentration effects of large urban areas. And this is another map showing, well, if we did, we did many of these layerings and sort of reading certain potentials of the data together in the maps. This is a map that would tell you, well, the blue is the settlement already, the settled area already. The black stuff is what is definitely non-tangible because it's protected landscape. So I'm saying by no means everything that is white should be covered and become blue. That's absolutely not the point. But can we look for patterns within the structure where it can become more blue? And maybe, and this is an approach we keep finding Europe-wide, it's probably better if you want to take this approach to think it from the black, so to say, to think, what are the landscape potentials and secure the land for the landscape, and then try to define where this existing body of urbanized land can reasonably be densified along the existing corridors. So another very specific and very interesting map we did is the commuter map, because normally people would tend to commute to the one largest node, or that's what we think. Whereas if you look into that region, they tend to communicate to all directions. They basically, some of them live in the largest node and commute elsewhere, where the biodiversity, biochemical cluster is, or automotive cluster is, or whatever. So it's in that case, and I would bet that is the case in a lot of the urbanized territory, that pattern that people from supposedly rural areas pour into the big city in the morning and then get out of it in the evening is not true anymore, but instead it goes vice versa, and it goes to all sorts of direction. In fact, you have problem in the larger dots. You have problems to get into the city, to get out of the city in the morning, not to get into the city at the morning with a car. Global player, catchment areas of these kind of guys. So what we do in this specific case in the southwest of Germany is two things. We first of all started at the university, we started that research. We're doing the atlas. We're trying to read out data. All the maps you've seen is purely data-based. There's no guessing or anything. It's just visualizing of existing statistic data. We overlap, we layer them, and we see if we can we read a pattern, can we read a potential for what? For any approach to coordinated and cooperating development in the region. Because now I have to tell you another story, and I can best do it with this image. There is an existing rail which goes from here, this is the city of Ulm, all the way down to Lake Constance. But it has not been electrified so far. At the moment, this railway, this seems just a detail, is being electrified. If you know, though, that this city, Ulm, sits in between Stuttgart, which is the largest city to the east, and Munich, which is the next largest city to the east. And this railway, at the moment, is also being modernized and it's becoming much faster. Then all of a sudden, you can imagine that with a faster rail, much faster rail, and the electrification, which means that this stretch is much better connected than it was before to the largest stretch, little towns like this or this one could potentially become housing areas for people who work in Stuttgart. They would just commute there in 45, 50 minutes, instead of now it's 70, 80. So there's a large change in the infrastructure accessibility of this area at the moment, which isn't, well, people know that there's some change in the train infrastructure, but it's only starting that they would try to break this down to say, well, what does it actually do to our regional development? So, said this, the question would be, I have to say something else. I don't know if you're probably familiar with that, but like everywhere else, like in London or in New York, for example, also some of the German cities, not all of them, but some of them, and very specifically Munich or Stuttgart, that have always been very rich and very attractive and very growth-prone cities, they are almost not affordable anymore. Many cities in Germany now try to counteract that and limit their the rents, but still, it's almost not possible anymore to live in Munich if you have a regular job. So chances are that people start to try to live somewhere else and then commute into the city. And the questions that we want to raise now with our research approach is, could we not, and I'll come back to that later, could we not, given that this whole stretch is already urbanized, has in parts a performance that, well, it's a bit, proposed to say, has an economic performance that is equivalent to London. Of course, it's not equivalent to London, but it is definitely not rural, but very urban and very high performing on an economical level. Could we not try to take some pressure that the large knots like Munich or Stuttgart are facing off these large, truly or classical urban areas, and look for more, densification and of this stretch in between and in around the very well accessible public transport knots, and stretch it out from there. This can't be achieved within municipal boundaries, because if you look at that, you have along this line, it's neither one city nor is it one metropolitan area. It's 5, 6, 7 larger municipalities and even smaller in between. So any idea of how a compact, coordinated and connected growth, affordable housing, location of new business areas, with respect to very important landscape patterns, any idea of how this could be conducted can only be on an intermunicipal level. So Germany doesn't have a regional planning authority. That's not the case. It has a national authority, has a federal authority, and then it's the municipalities. In between, it's loose cooperation if cities want to cooperate. We don't have a regional, or normally we don't have a regional planning authority. So what we did now, and that's actually quite a pilot thing, there was a call for papers on a national level for intermunicipal approaches to planning, and we succeeded in finding 4 cities, namely Ulm and 3 others on the line, to apply together for that program with the concept, say, could we not look into the potentials of densification along this new infrastructural line if we do it together. So I was actually very proud of it, because it's really for all of the 4 municipalities, is totally thinking out of the box. We got the mayors who, given the picture and given not only the economic performance, but also the landscape potentials, also the situation that the infrastructure and the accessibility of the region is completely reversed now. They agreed actually in applying to the program together, and we are curious this is just, I mean, this is going to be due in February, whether they really get the funding or not. And if they do, we will really, you know, have the chance to look at the so we put it like that. We would look at the potentials of land use, pretending like as if there was no municipal borders, and try to distribute with all the 4 cities the stretches of land where any growth or any densification, be that housing or be that mixed use or be that commercial, would most reasonably go. And if we see that pattern, we would think about any potential governance structure to be able to do that. I'm going to talk about the governance structure later. So that is, you know, that is a potential which I would say it wouldn't have been feasible without the mapping, because you could have talked to people, but they wouldn't have seen the image. That's one thing. And the other is obviously that, well, that's a specific thing that all 4 mayors in these cities happen to be planners. So that was maybe easier to convince them because of that. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm just going to mention very briefly, we're going to do a conference, an international conference on the issue next year in autumn, trying to bring together the knowledge that has been accumulated, as I learn also here, but also in Belgium or North Italy or the Netherlands, for example, or the Ruhr area, very famously, and Switzerland, on that issue of intermediate density. So we didn't tell the mayors only how their city was structured. We also made them familiar with a couple of precedents. And I'm going to show you 4 of them and point out, without being able to explain the whole project, but point out what is the thinking in these projects that all go or try to go across borders, and what is the potential they raise, and how are they doing this. This is a scheme for the Crossrail in London. The Crossrail is a new infrastructural link. So obviously, I mean, that was very easy to compare what that link throughout London does for London, and then break it back to the new link in the corridor Ulm and the 3 cities down to Lake Constance that I've shown you. So as we could explain how the Crossrail changes the accessibility of parts of London, and how this has already been recognized in terms of real estate added value, you could very easily transport from that London image the knowledge back to that home area, and convince the mayors and everybody else on the table that this is going to happen likewise, although it's not in the middle of London. So actually, the London Transport for TfL, Transport for London agency, has built their business model on this. They have built their business model on the fact that the Crossrail, which is a new railway, a new train running east-west through London, high speed, connecting the airport to the inner city and then back to the other airport. And it has also quite purposefully been built through underprivileged areas, or at least some of them. And in the circles, I can't explain the project to you, I just want to make the point that inside the circles, of course, that there are some parts of London that all of a sudden, through this line, are much better connected to the center and to the airports, and of course that has an influence. And everybody understands that immediately within London, that inside here, the circle, the violet circle, the reds are going up, or like the real estate prices are exploding. Yeah, of course, everybody says, of course, that's the case. And then we say, well, basically, the same thing is going to happen with your infrastructural link being electrified and being very well connected to Stuttgart and Munich all of a sudden. Not that dynamically as in middle London, admittedly, but the same thing is going to happen structurally. So that was a very interesting precedent to be able to show the economic potentials and economic logic that would lie behind a new infrastructural link. And the point is going to be always the same with the 4 precedents I show you. One is happening in a classical urban territory, and everybody immediately understands the logic. If you put it outside the classical urban territory and read the potentials in that urbanized land I'm talking about, the logic is basically the same. Diversity. Another project from England, we've been taken as a precedent that Fifth Studio has done it. It's a very interesting architecture planning office from the UK. So they've been looking into a much larger area, which already here in this image looks a bit similar to the corridor I've been showing you. It's the Cambridge east-west connection, also connecting a pearl of individual towns through new transportation means. So you could make that whole infrastructure point and the real estate economical point I've just made likewise. But that was interesting because they were looking very specifically, they were zooming in very specific locations along that corridor, identifying the physical patterns of the already built structure. And I would ask you to look into the structural plans here. And of course, in a way, you find it all along that stretch. It's not the right idea that only because you're outside a large agglomeration, it's only sprawl. Instead, you find that you have all sorts of different settlements, different densities, different land use patterns, historical settlements that have remained that way, historical settlements that have changed, additions from the 60s, additions from the 80s, additions from the last 10 years that have, for example, when I came from the airport last night, there's that huge shopping mall you have here. Like, you know what I say when I say new centralities, you know immediately what I want, I guess. Like, new arrangement, especially along existing corridors of transportation that don't have anything to do with the old idea of a city, but attract people and produce what we call new, or not we, but what is called new centralities. So what this president is very fertile, or has resulted to be very fertile, is to talk about the potentials of densification in an already diversified manner. Meaning, if you look along the corridor, what is already there, and you look at the potentials in terms of program, but also in terms of built physical space, and you try to add things that fit with what is already there, you potentially come up with a highly diversified, also built physical space, in addition to economical performances. So I think this is relevant, because if you talk about resiliency and resilient development, the fact that it has to be something that is specified and not always the same structure and too much of the same monofunctional, but monostructural patterns, but that you come up with an idea of how to produce diversified patterns seems to be also very important. So economical, physical approach, and then a third precedent, which is maybe a little pattern for saying think smart. Collect it all together and think smart. This is a Brussels example we've taken as a reference. You can't see Brussels, you can only see a canal that runs through Brussels. And I just explain you the logic. The Brussels, this canal has been built in the industrial area, in the time of industrialization, and obviously it has all sorts of port and industrial functions. Some of them terrific, some not, but it's sitting in the middle of the center. Brussels, at least as Riga, is split in many municipalities, and that canal runs through various of them. If each of these municipalities looks at their own little development area, yeah, that can be changed. But this project, which has Chemetov architects from France have done that, they said, well, we just map it out for you if you draw it all together. If you identify all the areas that potentially need change along that canal, then you get a totally different idea of how central Brussels could have, what kind of common development agenda you could have if you look at the potential together. So this is one thing, is the mapping, and the other is, and that's what we use that example for, is they actually within it's true that it's different municipalities, but they are already connected in Brussels under the umbrella of Brussels Capital Region, so they have some sort of institutional possibilities to approach that. And what they've done is that they formed a so-called regional domain. So normally you would have that in an inner city area that needs urban regeneration, but inside municipal borders. And that regional domain is actually a framework to get access to all these, to a facilitated approach of regeneration on the whole stretch of the canal, although it's running across municipal borders. So that's the thing, and then I have one more last thing. There has been, and that I also find very fertile, when we were doing this and preparing the call for the paper with the 4 mayors, and we were trying to convince them, we found that it's on one side very fertile and very helpful to look into these big city approaches and big city examples and what has worked there. But on the other hand, we were finding a governance approach in a project that is called Ruurbans, rural, urban, and it has been European territorial cooperation in the Alpine spaces, and they were basically in very remote areas looking into governance potentials of cooperation. Very diverse one, and I can't, you can ask me later on it, maybe to become more specific if you want to. I want to keep general on that. The European Union founds cooperation, also transnational cooperation in various regions, and the Alpine region is obviously running south of Germany, Austria, parts of Italy, and I believe parts of Slovenia. And they identified territories that run across borders, and they were trying to improve rural-urban cooperations on specific project areas within the whole region of that Alpine space. Mainly looking into governance models. And there's a large report on it, which reports every single case. But the overall story is, obviously, we were not able to reform this all within 3 years, or 4, or what's the length of the program. But they did find that there's different models of governance, or different potentials for governance that resulted to be fertile. Either it was when there were sector cooperations between different sectors that, in the hierarchy that hadn't cooperated before, or if there was sector cooperations across 2 different areas, or if the policymaker was not each time talking individually to one stakeholder, but would make the picture up and talk to different stakeholders all of a sudden, or if there was a mix of these models. So this is all documented very neatly, and you get all sorts of ideas of, and then they would also identify, some what works potentials that they had found in their cooperation. So my point is, you get inspiration not only from looking at the large city agendas, but just as well sometimes if you look at the so-called rural stuff. If I want to wrap this all, I would say, well, we've just said, well, initially we said don't look at the large centers only. Then I told you a bit about my own background and research and area where I come from. maybe before we finish, we want to remind ourselves that, again, this is the density pattern of Europe, and you see, what I showed you before, all the yellow stuff, I would say. I show you this image not to stress this is there, but to make the point that there's a change on the level of the European Commission at the moment, because they have also in the institution where they monitor the data. They found out recently, namely a guy called Louis Dijkstra, who's the head of that department. They, in the last years, reformed completely how they measure density in Europe. To put it simply, is that before that, each nation basically reported their density statistics to the EU, and they were mapping that out together. But the different nations had different methodologies to monitor density. So the map that we got familiar with more of the larger red dots all across countries, was also a result of very different approaches nationwide, how to measure and how to map density. So these guys now try to have a more equilibrated approach using some sort of grid that they spread all over Europe, and they really, with the population data they get from the different nations, but also with some sort of satellite monitoring, they try to equilibrate that and come up with a more, with a overriding methodology to measure density all throughout Europe, and this is what we get. And I think this is where you are. And I don't know if that resonates with you, or is that how your country looks like. But the point is that obviously that idea of the compact European city that is somehow circumvised, like maybe something here still is not the case, and you need an additional leitmotif. I skipped that because I can show it better with this. So if this general procedure on a European level has had results already in research on a European level, saying that many cities face that problem that we see here in Brussels or Riga or anywhere else, that you have a metropolitan area that you really can control, which is the striped one, that you have a metropolitan urban area, which most cities are still somehow conscious of, that it's not within your municipal boundaries, but the territory you should control or should somehow cooperate with in planning is actually larger, which has been called metropolitan urban area for quite a while already. Then you have the green stuff, which is the functional urban area, which is most of the time the reach of your transportation network. And then you have transportation network, and then you have something else, which is the metropolitan development area, which is where cities would identify their potentials for whatever reasons, where development or densification or further building would be suitable. So this is only in parts overlaid, and normally you don't have access to that in terms of institutionalized planning. Same idea for Oslo, just to give you an idea. And of course, this is how it looks like. This is not, only in my area, it's also in the fringes of the metropolitan areas. The same exactly discussion could be made from what I've shown you about the small and larger cities. And of course, this comes back to what I've seen before. Our argument would always be to say, given the pressure those big letter cities are facing in terms of densification, in terms of real estate market prices and everything, could we not succeed in putting our densification ambitions and affordable housing and what you need reasonably in urbanized area, densifying where it's suitable and protecting the landscape where it's good. So this goes also beyond Europe. Just to make that final point, this is an image from the last Urban Age conference that was in Africa, just lately borrowing the image again. But obviously, this is not only monocentric, large cities. This is the same stuff lying under here. And also in America, and this is my almost my final picture. This is the traditional mapping of America, and like in largely urban, rural, or some urban and suburban areas. And interestingly, the same, what I've told you about the European Union, the same change of methodology is happening in the US. So if you map that, not reporting from different statistics that the nations or the federal states would give you and bring it all together, but if you map it with the same method, then you come up with this. Yeah. So this has actually been a map that has been drawn to explain the voter behavior in the US, interestingly enough. So my final point would be we probably have to come up with an idea, this is Brussels again, of a resilient togetherness of landscape and settlement and water, blue, green, red, in a controlled way, in a compact way, in a coordinated way, and in a well-connected way, obviously. This is not an argument for sprawl, but this is an argument for additional leitmotifs and then additional planning structures. Questions and answers.
Thank you.
But my thing is, like, what are the future challenges within the new context of Horizon Europe? Horizon Europe program is like upcoming budget planning for the European Union. Have you set any new targets besides those that you have mentioned?
Well, I'm not coming from the European Union.
No, but within that we all are within the European Union.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. I think there's some what the European funding so far has also been split up, from what I know, and I'm not an expert on it, on either functioning urban contexts or rural contexts.
Yeah.
And in fact, it has inhibited cooperation in a way, not only between rural and urban areas, but also between some urban areas. And it has inhibited, and I know this is this I really know that this is under criticism, because the European Union either funded, either had structural funds, or it had social funds, and you could never combine them. In fact, that was, it was a no-go. It was exclusively either you could apply for structural funding or you could apply for social funding. That said, each city with an integrated development program is now convinced that they have to combine the two, that you have to have social and structural and physical space and economic approaches to get the real picture. So there's one program, and I think it's part of the Horizon also, of the upcoming, I'm not sure, but I think, which is called Integrated Territorial Investment. And that exactly is a method that they have already, run that for the last phase. And in fact, that Rurbans project I was saying in the Alpine spaces, that was on the integrated integrated territorial investment. And this not only allows you, but it asks you to combine the social and the infrastructure or structural investment. My point is that I think there's a shift also on the European level towards integration of these aspects. That's one thing. And then there's something which is called the European agenda, the urban agenda for the EU, which gives a lot of it gives a new power to cities, quite obviously. And the cities are networking in all sorts of working groups, trying to come up with something that gives a base for the European Union to distribute their money differently from what they've done before, because now they've given it to nations, and then it sort of trickled down in each nation, and following certain rules. But once they have new actors on the agenda, be that cities or city corporations, they have basically no clue, how to distribute the money in a fair way. This calls. I think there is the idea that new policy is needed, which is what the urban agenda stands for, but I don't think it has been achieved. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
It just leaves a lot of room for, I'd say, it leaves a lot of room for cooperation on different regional levels. It's like between country-wise, as the same you mentioned in your presentation about Swiss, German, and French, Belgian cooperation. Just like that creates more work too.
Well, Swiss, Belgium, and German, I'm not sure.
No, I'm sorry.
Well, the Alpine is around.
Yeah.
You have these sort of things. What the conference would be about, knowledge exchange, because all the nations in the blue banana, they obviously look into that stuff. Ruhr area has done a lot. Switzerland has done a lot, and there is a lot of knowledge. But it's not, at least from my perspective, it hasn't. First of all, it hasn't been that much on the agenda as it could be, and secondly, it hasn't been exchanged that much because it's not. It's because everybody has been focusing on that compact European city idea, basically, which is fine, but not the only not the solution to grapple with the rest of the world.
I mean, I think that makes what you said on the end. It makes a lot of sense for my understanding of the issue. That I think that we have been really failing in the last 20 years, as hip partly the idea of the suburbia was. Not only in terms of musical memories, but also in other terms. We have really failed to accumulate the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
We gathered, I think, a lot of knowledge, to be very honest, just looking on maybe a little bit different cases, and that what you have been talking about, one of the leading force in regional development definitely is Finland and Norway. Mm-hmm. They invested a hell of knowledge, fantastic knowledge, but they accumulated within their national frames. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, even within the national frames, it hasn't been distributed. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. You have 20, 30 years of studies on the Finnish triangle, Turku, Tampere, Lahti, Helsinki, and nearly nobody out of planning circles knows anything about that. Mm-hmm. Even not economic investors and whatsoever. I mean, people just really don't know about it. So everybody blames everybody as to be not like open enough and transparent enough. But probably in the end of the day, we all know that in the Nordic countries, and I'm including Latvia there, that communication is not our strongest tool, and that we are not always like reaching out immediately. But then again, looking back in my home country and what you were reporting, looking on Germany, and you're totally right. I mean, yes, we are failing very much to have regional strategic development. Although in North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, exists because we have the Bundespräsidenten, so I mean, all the planning actually takes place there. But it doesn't mean that the municipalities within one of the regions exactly know what is happening in the strategic thinking in the headquarters. It's crazy. So I think this aim to finally like bring this knowledge together, like you said in the conference next year, as an example, but also with the project that you're aiming for, is like enormously important to my mind. And most of all, I think it's like very important to understand what has been achieved as, and I think nobody looks in that, in all of the international building exhibitions, in the IBAs. also in that area is one IBA, that urban land area. I don't know in which way there is an exchange, for example, and they are like very much focusing exactly on that. Or look on the IBA in Turing currently. They are really looking on the outside of the city, exactly this model. Nobody, even in the, say, like more popular media is like taking that in consideration. The funny point is that here, exactly in Latvia, we have a situation more than in Lithuania, for example, which was for a strange reason completely blinked out in this map, this European map.
It's all
green. Was there.
I
was quite funny. You see, Lithuania doesn't have any small, very small dots, nearly non-visible.
There are two.
Yeah, while the densification definitely is, and regionalization is much more heavy, I guess, than here in Latvia. Well, Latvia has quite something to see.
But also you can say Kiruna region.
Yes.
It looks a bit strange.
Yeah, it looks a bit strange, yeah. Also, yeah, for example, southwest France, around Bordeaux. I mean, it's massive what's happening there. Don't see anything. So yeah, I mean, whatever. But I think on that level, there is still something to actually learn. And what I feel is that there is an opportunity to do something that we were like talking already in the institute about like 5 years and more ago. Like when do we finally start to make this east-west knowledge transfer, which doesn't exist? And we really have to tell something about regional development in these countries. We have experience, not always the best.
No,
but we really tried to reach out, as difficult as it is. I mean, one example, we did a huge project with the Ministry of Regional Development on intermunicipal cooperation. My goodness. I mean, Belgium, Germany, you mentioned both of the cases, are like the highlights in Europe on that. They really know what it means. Like, is it on water supply, is it on waste management or whatsoever? To bring two municipalities in Latvia together, sit next to each other and say like, okay, maybe we have that issue with energy or with something. Impossible. So that actually takes place now. It started. Very successful. And all the stories are so well developing, so fast, and as we are a small country, as Eva said earlier, things are going a bit faster. So I think this, what you are presenting here, has a huge potential in countries like Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. Huge potential. So you would have, I think, not only in Riga and surrounding, looking on your interest in the study further on, no, you will have a serious potential in these countries to find partners to deal with and to talk about this issue, because it explains many of their questions. Which doesn't mean that it doesn't take like another 30 years or generation to construct something, but yeah. In Germany, it's more the case of deconstructing, I think, than of constructing.
Yeah, I mean, what we find is actually there's two door openers. One is energy and one is water. Because with an energy issue, it's very easy to explain how mutual benefits are. That's, very easy to explain and very, also to private parties, very immediately understandable. And the water is the anxiousness. So, in Belgium or in the Netherlands, they do it with the water issue because that's can't be resolved by one party alone. So
the IMC is running well here in Latvia based on water. It's like specifically along the rivers. There we have very good developed items.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense, but you also can use that sort of that dynamics that comes from that new consciousness, let's put it like that, and make it usable for other planning issues. Or a more general approach to say, well, given that we now understood that we need to do it together, we can just as well think about planning in a new way. Okay.
No more questions in the moment? Okay, then
Okay.
I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank
Professor
you.
Meyer, for your coming to Riga and sharing
Thank you.
your experience. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for coming today in this busy time for Christmas. And maybe there are still some questions left for more informal discussions with our speaker today, so we can continue our discussions outside the room with some tea or coffee. Thank you. Have a nice day.
And maybe